So I don't know what I'm gonna title this video yet, but it's going to be something about how we kind of like expect people to be born ready and kind of like knowledgeable about things. Because I've been kind of like thinking about this lately. I've come to the conclusion that I need to be a little bit more lenient with people, because sometimes people they do stuff out of spite, out of malice, but sometimes like they just don't know any better. Naturally, like the thing with a crime, like just the fact that you didn't know that it was forbidden, like it doesn't excuse it. You still have to face repercussions. So the same way that I'm trying to say is that like if you do something bad, you say something bad, like you have to face repercussions. But like I think thinking more about like the future. So like after, like there is the settling of scores, like what comes next. And I think that a possibility. I think the way that we approach it can kind of like make or break the situation. So somebody can, at a certain point, become like, they can get better. But depending on how like we approach the situation, like things can kind of like, I don't know, you can kind of like send people into those corners. Although I will say it is tiring to kind of like excuse people like that, excuse people and having to kind of like walk, in eggshells, around eggshells. What's the saying? Walking on eggshells, around a person, because if you kind of like don't talk to them in a certain way, they're going to become the enemy, like they're going to really embrace that role. So, there's a lack of maturity, to an extent that you have to kind of like excuse. And it's one of those things that like, it is not fair. You shouldn't have to kind of like exist this way. You shouldn't have to live your life like this. But it is nonetheless how, like things work a lot of the time. And I don't really have, I don't know, I feel like this me saying these things, like it's a mix of like me feeling like of me resigning, like to kind of like the way that things are. But also on the other hand, I'm still kind of like frustrated that like you have to kind of like be like this. And there's no right or wrong. I mean, there are like right and wrong things that you can say, but it's just that it feels like yeah, like it feels like, okay, why do I have, like, because somebody's saying something against you, or like a group of people that you're part of, like, why do I have to be the one to kind of like extend an olive, branch? Like, why do I have, to be, like the bigger person, and that is something that I think historically, when I think about, myself in my life, I really kind of like rejected that notion of being, like the bigger person. I'm not but like the thing is that you have to think on like of the big picture, and whether something works out or not. And I don't know, like I said, it's frustrating, but I'm trying to kind of like wrap my head around this notion, of yeah, like I'm expecting people to kind of like just come here ready, when we're all imperfect. We all have our limitations. We all have like the things that we struggle to get on. Like I have my biases. I have my like my tendencies, and people, they are not necessarily going to align with that. Like people are not going to necessarily fulfill those roles. And yeah, as I said, like I'm trying to just be a little bit more not empathetic. I don't think that's the word, but be a little bit more lenient. Yeah, I already said this, but I think that is a good word that describes it. Because basically, like yeah, like being lenient. It's just ultimately a way for me to just be less frustrated, because if I'm expecting less, from people, I mean, this is a wrong way to put it. It's not like I'm expecting less, but I'm expecting people to kind of, to I'm expecting them to kind of like still have to be there's like a learning curve, and people kind of like they can fall into different places there. And ultimately kind of like because if I have like these great expectations of like people of life, and sometimes I feel like, okay, my expectations are not even like that high. They're pretty average, but people still manage to kind of like fail to kind of like live up to that. And in the end, like I'm the only one who gets I'm affected, because like the people who are doing and saying things, like they're not God, I feel like a lot of times like there's not even like repercussions anymore. So like they're just doing whatever, and I'm over here affected, because of what they have, said and done. So I kind of like I want to live my life a little bit more lightly. I want to remove a weight off my shoulders, and basically, I don't know if this is. I feel like it is good for me, in terms of me kind of like no longer kind of like being affected by things, but it might also be bad for, I'm not going to say society because that's pretty magnanimous of me, but like that's bad, like for the rest of yeah, like for, I guess like socially you could say, because you should be trying to educate people, and that's the thing that I was mentioning. Like it is very tiring to be constantly having to educate people and to teach people about like different perspectives, or about how what they say and think isn't right, and like the fallacies and whatever. Like I think that I was kind of like like very on for a long time, when I was younger, and that really burned me out because I ended up kind of like really removing myself from many situations in the future, because because I was just burnt out, as I said. Like I was tired, and I was exactly like I was tired. I didn't want to have to explain myself and to kind of like justify my existence, which is something that I don't know, like the environments in which you inserted into, like they're always demanding that, at least like the environments that I was inserted into, particularly the ones that I didn't want to be in, but because of circumstances I was there. Sometimes circumstances, it can mean just it's just like, for example, sometimes I'm accompanying my parents, in whatever they're doing. So I ended up being kind of like exposed to some environments that kind of like they have this demand of, in which I have to kind of like explain myself, and I'm just really tired of that. Like I wanna. You could argue that I kind of like I want to live unapologetically, but I don't know. I think, can I just ignore people if they say something? They ask something of me. Can I just like pretend that they're not there? That's not very polite, but it is kind of like how I want to do things sometimes. I really want to just ignore people, and because also like a lot of like these questions and this demands that people have, like they really how do I put this, they kind of like they involve like me having to respond, because something that was kind of like small, then it becomes this bigger thing, because suddenly we're not talking just about about like this one thing that has been said. I think it comes from also the fact that like I feel the need to kind of like to educate people on certain topics, and as I said, I'm tired of doing this. So it's a mix of like me doing that, but doing like in a way that I'm doing it begrudgingly, because I kind of like just wish I could kind of like like just be without having, as I said, to kind of like explain myself. So I think this is the whole thing. Like it's not new, and I definitely feel like I'm dealing with it better than I would have when I was 18, for example. I think that right now I've had enough. I had enough lived in experience to kind of like just know how to sometimes end conversations in the quickest way possible. Just kind of pretending. I don't know, because on one hand, like a part of me feels compelled to kind of like, as I said, to say something, and to kind of like elucidate what people have to say. So they make one comment, and it's a comment that in itself it contains multitudes, you could say. Because there's sometimes people, they will say something that is kind of like, it's quite incredible just how many boxes it is ticking, in terms of like in terms of like a lack of knowledge, like a lack of understanding. Although I will say sometimes people, they refuse to learn. So like they're gonna say something, you correct them, and then they kind of like double down on whatever they were saying. And I think I kind of expect everybody to do that. So whenever people, they are a little bit more open-minded, it does surprise me, because I kind of like expect them to just really stick to whatever like beliefs that they have. And it's I don't know, like there's never going to be an ideal scenario. I think that part of me still kind of like hopes that, not hopes, I fantasize about, you know, a future, about, you know, like a world in which I could just, you know, kind of like be myself, and, you know, just that it isn't a big deal, you know, like that it's just, you know, like the way things are. And yeah, so I think I fantasize about ways of like making things better, but they're always kind of like low-key violent. I don't know, they involve pretty much just like eliminating people. Like, okay, so if this individual is no longer here, like, because the issues are still there, but you know, like if you remove certain pieces, things, they start to kind of like fall apart. So maybe, you know, like that could be something. I don't know what exactly, you know, the future holds, but I think my expectations are not particularly positive, you know, which is kind of bad because I've had some negative thoughts yesterday, you know, like some, you know, thoughts at the end, a couple, but only a couple of times, but like it is something that hadn't happened in a while, so it does really stand out. And I don't really know what exactly, I don't know, I can trust myself today to kind of like handle things, but like what about myself a week from now, a month from now, a year from now? Like, do I have it in me to kind of like to resist, or will I just kind of like, you know, give up? And that is not great because, you know, I don't want to just give up. I want to kind of like exist in a world. I guess like I want to exist like in a welcoming world, you know, like a world where, as I said, I can just, you know, be myself without having to explain things, you know, because that is kind of like very annoying, you know, like some days I'm very some days I don't mind, you know, as I said, having to kind of like, because it's not ideal. Like I think like that is like the bottom line. Like it's not ideal to have to justify yourself, you know, justify your existence. Like that is, you know, something that I think a lot of different people can agree, you know, because it's kind of like a very universal experience. Different people around the world, like they have different groups like that. There are different contexts, so it's not like I'm, you know, in this alone. Maybe that's kind of like what I need. Maybe I need community. You know, I have, you know, a place where I can kind of like vent. I mean, here is the place that I can vent, but I think that interacting with people, like it brings a different layer, you know, an interesting layer, a layer that, you know, I think can, you know, make things better for me. So sometimes you just need to, you don't even need, for example, uh, because the thing about it is that solutions, I think all solutions that I can think of, like they involve other people having to kind of like reach out to other people, and, you know, to kind of like make things better. And sometimes like you just don't feel like it, you know, you just feel like, you know, like just removing yourself entirely, you know, completely from whatever, you know, circle that you're living in. But by I don't know, like I think I go back and forth between like resist, fight, and just like hide. Not, you know, hide, but, you know, kind of like abscond, you know, like just be in your own little bubble and just stay there. But the thing is that about this bubble, because sometimes like we talk about bubbles and we kind of like it just about how information doesn't get there. That is, you know, something that I wish would kind of like happen, because it always, something always comes through, you know, and like that's the issue, you know, like the thing that is happening, you know, like that kind of like affects me. And this like bit me here. I don't know if you can see, but, you know, it's itching. But yeah, so I don't really have a solution. I don't have, because, you know, the right answer, it really feels like it would be to resist and fight and just get myself out there and, you know, continue, you know, talking, continue explaining, continuing, you know, having those conversations that I've already had hundreds of times, and that, you know, like they're very demeaning, because it involves people, you know, like this type of conversation that people have talking about, you know, others, and how these others, they assume they are no longer human, you know, like they're kind of, you know, like these entities, that, you know, like you can kind of like, that you don't relate to, you know, like talking about like their perspective from, yeah, because from like where they're standing, they're not really seeing any of that. So you kind of like end up, yeah, like things just get worse, because the thing about bubbles is that like everybody these days is in their own bubble. It's kind of like hard for you to see anybody like bridging the gap. And I understand why like you would want to kind of like remove yourself from many situations. As I already said, like a part of me always wants to I said hi, abscond. I want to abscond. And I can't fault anybody for not wanting, but like if you don't, something has to be done to bridge the gap. Basically, things are getting increasingly more polarized, and there is, things just get worse when like that happens. Life just gets harder, because this is something that I was writing about, and once I'm done with this video, I'm gonna resume writing about it. But it is this thing of how somebody who is human like suddenly becomes a monster, because it starts with like it's them, they're over there, and then like they become this other they become this other entities, and then for I realized you no longer see them as people. And this is something that I was discussing in my novel right now. So it's past couple days, so it's been an interesting development of me just thinking about because like I'm talking about other people, but like I also do that. I also put people in boxes. I'm conscious of that, at least. I'm conscious that like those are people. But sometimes it's hard for you to care about somebody's well-being when they don't care about yours. They don't care about like how whatever they're doing is harming you. Is harming, and maybe not you individually, but like you as kind of like whatever groups of people, whatever demographics you're part of. And so it's kind of hard to sympathize. And I'm not even saying, because like if this had happened a decade ago, when I was still kind of like a little attached to my Christianity, like I would have I would probably have considering like just not I'm not talking about like all Christians, I'm talking about myself as a Christian, but I was very kind of like high and mighty, a little judgmental, like I really kind of like look down people. So I don't think that I would have kind of I think that I would probably have been even harsher than I am at right now. Because right now, like I have this thing where I'm just trying to kind of like ignore, and I think that when I was younger, it would have been kind of like it would have been like harder, and yeah, it would have been harder to kind of like just remove myself, because I was very like in your face, very abrasive. So yeah, so I guess like just one of the many ways that living religion has kind of like improved me as a person. I'm seeing people, I'm trying to see people as people, specifically certain groups of people who kind of like say things and do things they're harmful. I'm not saying that you have to kind of like feel bad for them necessarily, or that you have to kind of like be an empath towards them or anything, but kind of like not forgetting that, particularly because I think if you're looking at it from the perspective like trying to change people, like if they're human, like they can be changed. If they're monster, I think they're more like set on their ways. So I think that like if you think about it that way, like it just makes things harder. But yeah, but I don't. So basically, like I'm in this dichotomy, because on one hand I feel like I should keep talking about things and like responding and interacting with people about certain issues, but on the other part I'm like, this is not good for my mental health, this is not good for my sanity. Let me just be here in my corner, because also like I think there's a part of me that has this very magnanimous vision of myself. I really believe that I can kind of like change the tides, change people's minds, and my experience has pretty much proved that is not the case at all. I think that I have had so many conversations, so many discussions, not so much these past few years, but when I was like 18 and a little older, I would really engage with people, would talk about things, and nothing ever came from it. So it's kind of hard, like that's the thing, like it is hard for me to, I don't know, I think I had to accept, how kind of like small I am in the greater, scheme, the greater, the big picture. Yeah, And I mean, like, I don't necessarily struggle with this. I think sometimes, like, the reason why I wish I had a voice and I had like some reach, like an audience or something, is because, like, maybe I wouldn't change anything, but just by saying, like, what I was thinking, like, that would that would make me feel better. Like, being heard makes me feel better. I think that is, a very common thing. It's not something new or groundbreaking, but I am kind of like realizing that, sometimes being heard, like, you don't have to be heard by a large audience. You can be heard by one person, and that, can be enough. But because I think for so long I didn't really have anybody, I was really kind of like, like isolating myself. It was one of those things. Uh, it was one of those things that I didn't really kind of like, I didn't really have anyone, so I wasn't really being heard. So my head decided to go to kind of like some extremes, like instead of like just thinking about like finding one person to listen to me, I was thinking about, like a large group of people, because, like there's also, I was talking about this the other day, the whole being passive aggressive thing, and how that in itself, because for so long I denied, I was in denial about it, and then, recently I'm like started to kind of like embrace that, and I realized that, some of the things that I would have said back when I had, like social media. I think Twitter specifically was the one that I reached out to the most. I would say things, and to some extent, like I think knowing that was registered there, like it made me feel better, but it was never enough. Like you want to say that, because it's not only about saying something, kind of like clearing things out. Like sometimes it's about hurting people. Sometimes like you want to say something that is going to sting, particularly like the people who are doing something, to you. So you kind of like, you want to kind of like fight back, and that is the way that you think. Like you use your words, and as I said, like, but the thing is, like, sometimes you throw something out there, but like it doesn't stay there. Like it comes back to you. And the thing is that sometimes, like, I think when you say something, like you're kind of like on it for a little while, but after, some time, you kind of like, you just leave this behind and you just want to move on. And this will kind of like force you to, stay in that situation. So there's that. But yeah, life, it is this, it's just sort of miscellaneous opportunities and situations, and some of them, like, I think you kind of like handle some of those situations better than others. And I think as long as you are kind of like aware that is the case, that like you're maybe not handling the situation as well, I think it's fine if you have like your moments, because that's the thing, like, maybe better, because sometimes naturally a part of me is always like, okay, if I know better, I want to like do better, but sometimes like you really fall prey to your older habits. And let me just, I think this is kind of, does this change anything? But yeah, sometimes like you kind of like, I want to do better, I want to be better, but some days, I'm just very much stuck in my ways, and I'm just kind of like, yeah, let me, I'm just going to do, do my worst basically. And I think that all of this is pain. All of this is kind of, yeah, like all of this is pain, because I'm hurt, so I want to hurt, and until I hurt someone, I don't feel good about it, because there's the pain, but there's also my ego, because I don't want to be, like that, kind of like the wounded party, so I kind of like, I do something, targeting different situations, and they will make me feel better. I don't really have a proper explanation for, like what exactly changes. Some days I'm kind of like, I'm happy and healthy, so I'm trying to do my best, and some days I'm kind of like stuck in my old ways. And it's kind of like, a very comprehensive change, because it's not just about like those moments. I think that there are moments of vulnerability, and always a struggle. It's kind of like, what came first, the egg or the chicken, because sometimes I'm like, is this affecting me? Does something happen, something that is really small, like, is this thing affecting me? Like, is this why like this all happened? Or is this affecting me more because something happened, and I'm kind of like you know, something, maybe not something happened, you know, like something changed, something shifted in my brain, and right now I'm vulnerable. So yeah, so pettiness is also kind of um, it's something that, like, in theory I can't excuse, because you know I want to be kind of like a stable, healthy human being, and you know, like, being petty usually kind of like gets in the way. But at the same time, you know, like, without it, it feels like I'm kind of empty sometimes. Feels like, you know, I'm not doing the thing. Although I will say that a positive change that I've been kind of like observing in my head is that sometimes I'm taking a step back, and basically, instead of, at first I feel kind of bad because, like, I had to do something, I had to say something, but then some time passes and I'm kind of like almost glad that I didn't engage, that I didn't say anything, I didn't do anything, particularly because some of the things that, you know, like, I want to do, they're a little on the criminal side, so it wouldn't be good for me. I'm not gonna ruin my life, you know, for, you know, some random person I don't know, or you know, for some principle we could argue. That is not something that you could have like a longer conversation, you know, like the principles, you know, like to what extent should I go to kind of like make myself heard, and to kind of like you know, to stick to my morals, because as I said, sometimes I feel compelled to say something and do something because, you know, it's kind of like what feels like the right thing to do. It is the thing that is going to improve life for me and others, you know, for people in general, you know, like in years to come. So naturally, like, that is pretty much the path I should take, right? But there is, you know, like, the element of you know, like, there are like the side effects, particularly because sometimes I think that, you know, when I was younger, I would kind of like really hope that, you know, like, something would happen, and I you know, like, that conversation would be extended so I could keep on, you know, like, basically being mean, you know, being clever too. So, like, it is kind of like a mix of cleverness and meanness. You know, I hope that the conversation kept going, because I was feeling, at least like on an immediate sense, I was feeling better about about that. But then what ended up happening is that I think sorry. I'm gonna wrap this up right quickly because I need to take a nap. Just kind of like doing writing and working on an assignment for school. It is a holiday today, so, you know, but yeah, it is, you know, the best day to kind of like get things done. But what I was saying is that I felt like, I think I was feeling empty, because, you know, I would feel a little bit better in the moment, but then after that, you know, I was kind of like stuck in this loop of, you know, discontentment, because I nothing happened, you know, ultimately, like, I didn't change anybody's mind, you know, and sometimes I think when you're like very mid, you're like in the heat of the moment, you really, maybe you don't even want change, you just want you know, to hurt the same way that you were hurt. So yes, I think that maybe what I have to do is think less in terms of like me being hurt and trying to work through the pain, because the same thing with like me kind of like getting angry, you know, when I'm sad, you know, like when I'm having some other, you know, negative emotion, because that is my way of like doing something about it, but it's not the best way of, you know, kind of like, it's not the best course of action. So basically what I need is to kind of like feel the pain, so, you know, like, so if I'm feeling it, so if I'm angry, I should kind of like feel the sadness and the despair and the despondency and all the emotions that, you know, like, came with that, because that was the only way for me to kind of like work through it, you know. It would be for me to work it out, it would be go through it. So kind of like I have, you know, so I think that in my head what I have to do is that whenever I see something, whenever I witness something, whenever I read something, consume something, whatever, in whatever shape or form it comes, you know, like, just kind of like let myself see it with, you know, like, sadness, you know, with like the despondency, and then I do something about it, because I think that if I process my emotions first, my tendency to kind of like do something or say something that I will regret later, you know, like, it's going to be lesser. And when I say that I regret it later, it's not so much because I regret having said that or done that, but more because of the consequences, you know. So there's that. But yeah, life is full of surprises, and, you know, this thing I'm struggling with today, maybe one day I will, you know, persevere. Not persevere, I will succeed, because I am persevering. I will succeed in not being affected. I think that that is kind of like the goal. You know, I want to, you know, get into one year, live through the other year, which is, you know, something that I have historically struggled with a lot. So yeah, I think that's it for today. So anyways, bye.